Every day, links that once worked lead nowhere. The internet we think of as permanent has always been quietly dying. A study of 27 million web addresses found that 65% of them were already dead by the time researchers checked. That is not a small number at all, that is the majority. The web we treat as a reliable record has always been, in truth, deeply fragile. Most of what has ever been posted online no longer exists in any form. The older a page is, the less likely it is to have survived. Of all links published in news articles from 1998, 72% now lead to empty space. Pages from 2013 fare somewhat better, but even they are going fast. A quarter of all pages created between 2013 and 2023 are now gone. The number grows every year, silently, without notice. Researchers who study this have found something most people find hard to accept. The average web page survives between 40 and 100 days before it either vanishes or becomes unreachable. Not years, not decades, days. Entire categories of human knowledge, posted online with the belief that the internet was forever, are gone before most people ever had a chance to read them. There is a common belief that digital things are more permanent than physical ones. We put documents online and stop printing them. We link to sources instead of keeping static copies. We trust the web as a stable record. None of this is true. In practice, digital content decays faster than paper. A newspaper from 1890 may still be readable in a library archive. A web page from 2010 most likely is not. Every broken link is a small erasure. 1,000 broken links in a day is history quietly going missing. Even the most carefully kept corners of the web are not immune. Over half of all articles on the world's most widely read reference site contain at least one dead link in their sources section. The footnotes point to pages that no longer exist. The citations, meant to trace facts back to their origin, dissolve into error pages. Scaffolding of the web's knowledge base is quietly falling apart. Government web pages are among the worst cases. Local government sites holding public notices, planning decisions, and emergency records are especially prone to vanishing. The study found that more than 1 in 5 government and news pages had broken links. These are not trivial pages, they are part of the public record. When they break, there is often no backup, no notice, and no plan to recover what was lost. The rate at which the web forgets is not slowing down, it is getting faster. As more content is made and fewer resources go toward keeping old sites alive, the gap between what is created and what survives grows wider each year. A small share of what is posted today will still be readable in 10 years. Most of it is already temporary, whether or not anyone has said so. The internet was built as a message network, not an archive. Its early designers cared about sending data reliably, but gave almost no thought to keeping content alive over time. The protocols that move data from place to place are robust. The addresses that tell a browser where to find content are not. A web address is a pointer to a location, and locations change. Nobody planned for permanence. When someone stops paying for a domain name, that name becomes free for anyone to buy. The old pages vanish. Sometimes the domain goes to an unrelated business, which replaces everything. Sometimes it sits empty, pointing nowhere. Either way, everything ever published at that address is gone from the open web. The billing system of the internet decides which history survives, not the worth of the content itself. Even when a domain is kept alive, the software that once ran the site often is not. A site built in 2005 may no longer work in any modern browser. The files might still sit on a server somewhere, but the code needed to turn them into something readable has become obsolete. This is called format decay, and it affects not just websites but every kind of digital record. The web does not mark its losses. There is no record of the things it used to know. The effect has a name: link rot. When a link stops working and leads to an error instead of the page it promised, the link has rotted. The term is clinical, but it captures something true. Information does not vanish all at once. It decays slowly and unevenly, piece by piece, the way organic matter breaks down until what was once solid is no longer there. A single web page rarely stands alone. It links to images on separate servers, to style sheets that shape how it looks, to scripts that make it work, and to other pages that give it context. Each of those dependencies is a separate link that can rot on its own. A page may still technically load, but appear stripped of its design or missing its images. Partial survival is common, full and intact survival is rare. One morning the server stops responding. The files still exist somewhere on a drive no one remembers. Sometimes the problem is not loss but change. A web address that once pointed to a news article now leads to a tabloid site. The science blog that closed was bought by an ad network and refilled with empty content. The address survived, but the content it promised was replaced without notice. Researchers call this content drift, and in some ways it is worse than deletion, because the link appears to work. Much of the web's content has always lived inside large platforms rather than on private servers. A post on a social site, a photo on a photo service, a video on a video platform, all of these depend on a company's decision to keep them available. When platforms change their model, lose money, or decide that old content is a cost rather than an asset, entire archives can vanish at once. When a major platform shuts down, the cascade of dead links it leaves behind spreads through the web for years. Every article that linked to it, every blog that quoted it, every thread that referenced it, all become broken at once. A single closure can break thousands of sources in an instant. The web is woven tight enough that no large deletion is ever truly local. The cost of running a server is simple and relentless. Someone must pay. For personal sites, small community projects and volunteer archives, the burden falls on individuals with no funding, no backup plan, and no way to know what happens when they move on. Countless forums, archives, and stores of specialist knowledge have been lost not because anyone wanted them gone, but because no one was left to pay the bill. The domain lapses on a Tuesday. By Friday, 20 years of shared knowledge redirect to a blank page. 404 error message is one of the most common things on the modern web. It means the server was found, but the page it was asked for is not there. 404 is not an ending so much as a scar. It is evidence that something once existed at this address, that someone cared enough to put it there, and that at some point the thread between memory and content was cut. Search engines create a strong illusion of coverage. The query returns results that make the web seem mapped and known. But search engines index only what they can reach. Pages behind paywalls, pages in formats their crawlers cannot read, and pages that vanish before they were ever crawled, none of these appear. The searchable web is a small share of the total web, and an even smaller share of the web that ever existed. Academic research has been badly affected. Studies that traced links inside published science papers found that the majority of web sources cited in peer-reviewed work became unreachable within a few years of publication. Researchers trying to check a claim published a decade ago often cannot access the original material at all. The footnotes of science, meant to make knowledge testable and traceable by anyone who cares to look, are riddled with rot. Courts have cited web pages as evidence, only for those pages to vanish before appeals were filed. Journalists have linked to documents that no longer exist, leaving readers unable to check the original claims. News organisations have published corrections that reference source material now gone. The real costs of link rot go well beyond nostalgia. They affect the accuracy of reporting, the soundness of legal proceedings, and the ability of public institutions to be held to account. Every broken link is a small question without an answer. What was there? Who wrote it? Does anyone still know? The early years of the public web produced an unusual variety of amateur content. Personal home pages, community forums built around niche interests, fan archives of creative work, and early wikis. All of these were a genuine flowering of expression that owed nothing to commerce. Most of it is gone. The record of what it felt like to be online in 1995 or 1999, now exists only in fragments. For over 2 decades, one multimedia format ran most of the web's interactive content. Games, short films, art tools, music players, millions of them made by amateurs and professionals alike. When the format was dropped and then removed from every major browser, a vast archive of creative work became locked away for good. The files still exist in some cases, but the means to open them does not. Hard drives hold folders of files no living machine can open. They sit quiet and unreadable. Amateur archivists have always been the web's most careful curators. Fan communities built large stores of creative works, translations, and discussions spanning decades of shared passion. These archives needed real effort to keep alive and depended almost entirely on a few dedicated people. When those people moved on, the archives often followed them into silence. Entire communities lost their shared memory without a single public announcement. Government bodies publish huge amounts of data. Environmental results, public health notices, infrastructure reports, policy papers, all posted online. But many agencies treat their websites as tools for today's news, not as lasting records. Old pages are deleted when departments are reorganised, when policies change, or simply to cut clutter. The record of what governments knew, when they knew it, and what they chose to do is quietly being erased. Government agencies often treat their sites as current tools, not lasting records. When a department is restructured, its old site is taken offline along with everything else. There is no rule that says the content must be archived, no process to move it, and no plan for what happens to the documents that were once accessible there. 10 years of public records can disappear in an afternoon, replaced by a redirect or nothing at all. Journalism has a particular archiving problem. Local papers that moved online in the 1990s and 2000s often stored their archives on software that became obsolete. When papers were bought, merged, or closed, their digital back catalogues were usually not transferred. Decades of local reporting, coverage of community events, and records of ordinary life in thousands of towns simply ceased to exist in any accessible form. Social media holds a detailed record of how people communicated, what they argued about, and what mattered to them at each moment. When platforms change their rules, restrict access, or close entirely, the record is locked away or destroyed. Hundreds of billions of posts from the first 2 decades of mass social media are now gone or beyond reach, including some of the most historically important public exchanges of that period. Some of the most useful content on the early web came from communities of practice, craftspeople, engineers, gardeners, and hobbyists sharing detailed knowledge in specialist forums. This content was written with care by people who truly knew their subjects, and it answered questions no textbook covered. Much of it is gone. The specialist knowledge of thousands of communities, built over decades of shared work, vanished when their platforms did. A forum that ran for 18 years closes on a Sunday. No migration, no final archive, just a blank page. Historians and archivists have argued at length that the early internet's amateur output is a genuine cultural record. It shows how ordinary people in the late 20th and early 21st centuries processed events, built communities, and developed new forms of expression. Losing this record is not just inconvenient. It is like losing an era of folk music or personal letters. The scale is hard to fully take in. A common reply to worries about digital loss is that content posted online must exist somewhere, cached by search engines or copied across servers. This is mostly wrong. Search engine caches are short-lived. Copies made without intent to preserve get deleted when they become inconvenient. The web has no built-in system for content preservation. Anything that lived in only one place is almost certainly gone if that place no longer exists. One of the most unsettling things about the dead web is that you cannot search for what is gone. A search engine only returns results for content it has indexed. Content that was never indexed, content that was indexed briefly and then deleted, and content whose data has completely decayed, none of this shows up. You cannot know what you're not finding. The absence looks exactly like an answer not existing. The first people to take the problem seriously were not governments or tech companies. They were librarians, archivists and individual enthusiasts who saw in the late 1990s that the web was making culture faster than anyone was saving it. They began building tools and institutions that will become the main defense against digital decay. Large-scale web crawlers that visit and copy pages before they vanish, storing them in archives that can be reached later. Automated systems visit and copy millions of pages every hour. Most will vanish from the live web within a year. The web has over 1 billion active sites and makes content at a pace no archive can match. The combined effort of every web archiving body on Earth captures less than a fraction of 1% of all new content published each day. This is not a failure of will or ambition. It is a simple gap between the scale of what is made and the resources available to preserve it. The gap is structural. The largest single archive of the web has been running since 1996. Over 3 decades, it has crawled the public web without stopping, building a store that now holds hundreds of billions of saved page states. A researcher who wants to know what a news site published on a specific date in 2004 can often find the answer there. The archive does not capture everything, but it has saved a large share of what the live web has lost. Much of the most committed preservation work has been done by volunteers. Small groups of enthusiasts identified types of digital content at risk, built their own tools and created public stores for material that large archives were too slow to catch. Niche software collections, early video game archives, repositories of creative work from defunct platforms. These exist only because individuals decided the work was worth doing without any promise of support. A box arrives at a volunteer's door. Inside, a drive from a server that ran for 12 years. The work of archivists, institutional and volunteer alike, has produced real results. Billions of pages that no longer exist on the live web are accessible through public archives. Tens of thousands of software programs from the early years of computing have been recovered, documented, and made usable through emulation. Animations and games once thought permanently inaccessible are now playable through archive projects that built compatibility layers years after the original format ended. These are genuine wins. One of the most powerful tools in digital preservation is emulation. We're creating the software environment that old programs expected to run in. A program that needs a specific operating system from 1994 can be made to run inside a careful simulation of that system on entirely modern hardware by volunteers who studied the original system in fine detail. This approach has rescued enormous quantities of software and media that would otherwise have become completely unreachable to anyone. The community of archivists has developed its own tools, methods, and culture around web preservation. Members watch for sites that appear likely to close, sometimes acting within hours of a closure notice to save as much as possible before the servers go dark. They share tools for taking complete copies of entire websites, along with techniques for handling dynamic and restricted content. The work is collective and urgent. Universities and national libraries have increasingly treated web archiving as a core duty. Some countries maintain national web archives that take snapshots of their entire web domain at regular intervals, building a year-by-year record of national digital culture. These archives are not always open to the public, and their coverage is never complete, but they represent a formal commitment to the idea that digital content deserves the same care as physical documents. The crawler reaches the page 48 hours before it disappears. No one planned that. It was simply luck. Preservation advocates argue that digital content deserves the same treatment as physical cultural heritage. A medieval manuscript is preserved at real cost and effort because scholars know it cannot be replaced. Early web content, the creative output of the first generation to grow up online, deserves the same institutional care. The ease of copying a digital file today does not mean it will be easy to preserve across decades. The two problems are entirely different. A researcher finds the archive copy. It loads on an old rendering engine. The words are still there. The preservation community had spent decades arguing that the main threat to digital history was neglect, failing to keep servers running. letting domains lapse, not moving content to new formats. By 2026, a new threat had appeared that was far more deliberate. Major publishing bodies began actively blocking web archiving tools from saving their content, telling archive crawlers to stay away. For the first time, content was being withheld from preservation, not by accident, but by decision. The stated reason was artificial intelligence. Publishers feared that archived copies of their articles could be used to train automated systems without permission or payment. The concern was not unreasonable. Using web content to train large automated systems had become a deeply contested legal and ethical question. But the effect of blocking archive access went far beyond any such dispute, removing entire bodies of journalism from the historical record in the process. A single configuration file, updated on a quiet afternoon, removes years of journalism from the archive's reach. When large and influential publishers chose to block archive crawlers, others followed. Practice spread from a few early cases to dozens of major news bodies within months. Each new edition removed not just current content, but all future content from that source as well. Archives that had given continuous coverage of major outlets for 30 years found gaps opening in their records, growing wider with every passing week. Researchers and journalists who relied on archive access responded with alarm. Those studying political and social trends need to see how information was framed at specific historical moments. Those looking into misinformation rely on archives to show what was published before corrections were made. Without continuous preservation of major news sources, these kinds of inquiry become harder, and in some cases impossible, to carry out. She pulls up the archive link to check the original claim. The crawler was blocked. There is no copy. Social media platforms had already made preservation nearly impossible by restricting how their content could be accessed programmatically. By 2026, those limits have been extended to block archive services entirely. Billions of posts, discussions, and public announcements made on major platforms during historically important periods were no longer being preserved anywhere. The live record of public life was becoming permanently impossible to archive. Preservation advocates argued that web archiving should be treated as essential public infrastructure, not as a service individual companies could opt out of. The logic was clear. News organisations benefit from the trust that comes with being part of the historical record. Allowing publishers to withdraw from that record at will undermines the whole project of keeping journalism accountable over time. The argument found sympathy in academic circles, but little traction with lawmakers. As archiving restrictions spread, one category of information became harder to verify: claims made online before they were corrected, edited, or deleted. The ability to show what was said, when it was said, and whether it was later changed is central to accountability journalism and historical research. Without reliable archives, that ability erodes. Digital communication becomes less open to scrutiny the more of it is removed from preservation. Month by month, the archive grows incomplete. New gaps appear where steady coverage used to be. Future historians will notice. At the centre of the crisis is a real disagreement about who owns the digital record. Publishers say their content is theirs and they control where it is stored. Preservation advocates say that once something is published for public consumption, it becomes part of the shared historical record. Neither side is simply wrong. The outcome of this argument will determine what survives from the current era and what is simply lost. People making these decisions today are unlikely to see the full cost. The loss of the web's historical record compounds slowly across generations. Researchers 50 years from now, trying to understand the early internet era, will face silences in the archive the way earlier historians faced destroyed libraries. They will not know what they are missing. That is the nature of total loss. The absence is invisible. Not all digital content is equally fragile. Academic papers stored in multiple institutional repositories tend to survive well, because universities treat archiving as part of their core work. Content held in distributed systems, where no single point of failure can destroy the whole, is more resilient than content hosted on a single private server. Official government records, when properly maintained and migrated as formats change, can last for decades. The pattern is consistent. Survival follows institutional commitment, not technical sophistication. Some things from the earliest web still load. A plain text page from 1993, no images, no scripts, just words. The content that survives best tends to be the simplest. Plain text files, early hypertext pages, and basic sites with no external dependencies. These still open in any browser, on any device, with no special tools at all. Complexity is the enemy of lasting time. The more technology a file needs to be read, the more ways there are for that technology to become obsolete. The simplest things, those that need the least to work, outlast everything built around them. A new wave of preservation thinkers is working on ways to make archiving more distributed and harder to disrupt. Rather than relying on one body to run one large archive, these approaches spread copies of preserved content across thousands of separate storage nodes. If any one node fails, the others hold. If any participant stops taking part, the content is still accessible elsewhere. The goal is to make deliberate deletions structurally very difficult to accomplish. Individual users have always acted as informal archivists. The habit of saving local copies of pages, documents, and media that seemed worth keeping has preserved things no institutional archive ever captured. Personal email archives, saved browser pages, and hard drive collections of downloaded content. These informal stores represent a genuine form of distributed preservation that runs alongside and sometimes ahead of formal efforts. The web's preservation record includes enormous contributions from ordinary people who simply pressed save. The case for urgency is simple. Every day without comprehensive archiving is a day of irreplaceable content lost for good. The window for saving much of the early web has already closed. What survives from the period 1990 to 2005 is a small share of what was originally created. The years from 2005 to 2020 are better covered, but still deeply incomplete. The current moment is the last clear chance to prevent the same outcome from repeating for recent years. She never meant to be an archivist. She just saved things she found interesting. Some of it exists nowhere else. Future historians of the early internet era will face an unusual problem. People wrote more, communicated more, and published more of their inner lives than any generation before them. Yet the survival rate of that material is, in some areas, lower than for much earlier periods. A letter from 1850 is more likely to survive in an archive than an email from 2005. The richness of the digital era and its fragility come from the same source. Someone in 2076 will search for what life felt like online in 2015. Many of those searches will return nothing. There is growing recognition, in academic circles and in policy discussions, that digital preservation needs the same institutional support as physical preservation. The question is no longer whether this matters. Researchers, journalists, and historians have built the case thoroughly enough that it is essentially settled. What remains is the harder work: funding, governance, legal frameworks, and the willingness of publishing and platform organisations to participate rather than withdraw from the shared project of keeping the record intact. For all the loss, what survives is still meaningful. Hundreds of billions of archived web states, terabytes of saved software, collections of early digital art, music, and writing that would have vanished entirely without the work of dedicated archivists. The record is incomplete and growing more so, but it is not nothing. The history of the internet era will be pieced together from what was saved, the way all history is, from fragments and patience. The web's historians will work with what survives. They will piece together a picture of the internet era from cached pages, downloaded files, volunteer archives, and institutional collections. The picture will not be complete. Important things will be missing, and some of those gaps will never be filled. But the work of understanding this period, and the people who lived through it, will go on all the same. Incomplete archives have always been the condition of history. The internet is not forever. It never was. What we save now is what will remain. Somewhere in a drawer that has not been opened in 30 years, history is still waiting to be heard. The disc looks ordinary, a square of black plastic 3.5 inches across, its metal shutter slightly stiff, the handwritten label faded but still legible. Inside it, encoded in patterns of magnetism far too small for human eyes, there may be a lecture, a letter, the working draft of a discovery that was never printed, the machine that can read it. The specific drive, the specific operating system, the specific software may no longer exist anywhere on Earth. Around the world, archives hold millions of floppy disks, magnetic tapes, zip drives, and optical formats that are rapidly becoming unreadable. Every year, the last machines capable of reading certain formats fail and are not replaced. Every year, technicians who spent their careers maintaining vintage hardware retire, taking decades of knowledge with them. And every year, a small and quiet community of specialists races to recover what can still be saved before the window closes entirely and permanently. The magnetic coating that holds the data is slowly shedding. Every read may now be the last read. The 20th century is the most extensively documented era in human history. Offices generated paper in quantities that filled entire warehouses. Scientists published, universities archived, libraries catalogued. And underneath all of this, in a layer that few institutions noticed becoming fragile until it already was, an enormous volume of material existed only in digital form. Encoded on media built to be read by machines that are no longer being made in formats that may no longer have any living documentation. What is at stake is not old software or forgotten entertainment. What is at stake is the correspondence of heads of state, the working papers of prize-winning scientists, the unpublished research of academics who assumed their digital files would outlive their careers, the personal diaries, creative drafts, and professional correspondence of an entire generation, written in formats that have since been abandoned on disks that may since have shed the coating that held the data in place. In libraries, universities, and national archives, collections of donated digital media sit in storage, catalogued by label unread. Their contents are unknown. Their condition is undocumented. The volume of unprocessed material runs into the millions of individual items. The number of institutions actively engaged in recovering it is small. The number of specialists who know how to do the work is smaller still. And the media continues to degrade every day while that imbalance persists. Donated box arrives. Inside, among papers and photographs, a bag of floppy disks with handwritten labels. At a major research library, a multi-year project has been quietly working through thousands of floppy disks donated by researchers, writers, and public figures. The project combines traditional archival work, cataloguing, provenance research, access management, with the technical task of reading the disks at all. For each disk, the first question is whether the physical medium has survived well enough to be read. The second is whether the format can be decoded into something a modern researcher can actually open and use. Among the most significant finds were floppy disks belonging to a world-famous theoretical physicist, recovered as part of a larger donation of papers from his office. No one at first knew what to expect. When the recovery team managed to read the first disk, they found lecture notes and working drafts formatted in a word processing system designed for scientific notation. A system that had been discontinued. A system that nothing on a modern computer could natively open or render. In another collection, disks belonging to a senior government official held decades of personal correspondence that historians had never been able to access. Elsewhere, a poet's entire digital archive, working drafts that no one knew existed, emerged from a box of discs donated to a museum, still readable, barely. These discoveries have a quality that archivists describe as quietly astonishing. The material was always there. What was missing was simply the means to reach it. A magnetic tape machine sits motionless in a storage room. No one alive knows its precise encoding format. The problem is not just the physical disk. A floppy stores data in a format determined by the operating system that wrote it. There are hundreds of such formats, and they are not interchangeable. Each requires different software to read, different hardware to interface with, and often documentation that was never properly archived and may no longer exist at all. Many of these formats are understood today by no more than a handful of specialists anywhere in the world. And it is not only floppy disks. Magnetic tape was the primary backup medium for institutions throughout this same era. Tape formats are even more varied and even more dependent on specific hardware. Many archives hold thousands of tape reels, labelled, catalogued, and entirely out of reach. The labels say what is inside. The machines that could open them are museum pieces. The documentation for those machines exists in binders that may themselves have been discarded decades ago. In the Netherlands, a research team recovered data tapes from the country's first web development and hosting company, a firm that created websites throughout the 1990s for institutions and businesses. The tapes held not just the files themselves, but something rarer, the digital DNA of the early internet as it was actually built. Original source code. Original layouts. Working files of a moment that never expected and never prepared to be studied as history. A zip drive and a stack of zip disks sit on a shelf untouched, quietly becoming unreadable. The early internet is an extraordinarily fragile archive. Websites from the 1990s and early 2000s were built on servers that have long since been decommissioned in formats that browsers can no longer render. Those that were not captured by automated web crawlers, and most were not, simply vanished when the server was switched off. The tapes and disks made as backups during this era represent, in many cases, the only surviving record of what once existed at those addresses. A generation of artists, writers and musicians made their work in digital form for the first time during this period, saving it to media that is now unreadable. Graphic designers whose entire professional archive exists on formats with no surviving reader. Composers whose scores and studio sessions sit on formats no studio still has the hardware to play. An entire layer of cultural production, personal, professional, irreplaceable, is quietly expiring with each passing year. The scale of the problem becomes very real when considered at the level of individual people. A novelist who wrote all her drafts in a proprietary format on hardware she no longer owns. A scientist who kept his working notes in a database that ran only on a discontinued operating system. A filmmaker whose early edited work exists only on proprietary media for a system that has since been discontinued. Each would recognise the label on the disc. None can show anyone else what is inside it. A row of archive boxes stretches out of sight, each one labelled in a different handwriting, a different decade. In workshops and university libraries, in small preservation organisations and individual private collections, a community of archivists and technologists has formed around the problem. They are not a well-funded army, they are mostly small teams, sometimes single individuals, working with budgets that barely cover the cost of the equipment. What they share is a sense of urgency and a technical fluency that spans decades of computing history, from the earliest personal computers through to the last generation of optical disc formats. Materials arrive as part of larger donations: a box of papers, a filing cabinet, a storage unit, and somewhere inside, a bag of floppy disks. The disks are usually undated. They are labelled in ways that make sense only to whoever wrote the label. They have often been stored in conditions that were not ideal. Too warm, too humid, occasionally near magnetic fields that have partially erased what they were meant to protect. The recovery team receives them and begins carefully to assess. Provenance is one of the most important and most difficult problems in this work. A disc labelled in someone's handwriting tells you little about what software created the files on it, what operating system those files were written in, or whether the disk has been written to more than once. Often the only way to determine provenance is to successfully read the disk, which requires first having a working hypothesis about the format. It is a puzzle that requires solving itself. A cardboard box sits on an archival intake desk, the flaps open, rows of floppy disks visible inside. Beyond research institutions, the problem extends to individual estates, to the personal papers of people who kept meticulous digital records and whose families discover after their passing that the records cannot be opened. The files exist. The hardware to access them does not. And the expertise needed to recover the files without destroying them must be sought out, sometimes across countries, at costs that make recovery impractical for families without institutional support, significant resources, or prior knowledge of where to turn. No one has ever fully inventoried the scale of the problem, as no comprehensive survey has ever been undertaken. Libraries and universities know what physical media they hold, but not always what formats those media use, what operating systems created them, or how much of the data is still physically readable. The estimates specialists use are not percentages. They are simply more than anyone has the capacity to recover at the current pace of investment and awareness. A reliable total has never been produced. What makes this problem different from other forms of archival loss is its invisibility. A flooded archive shows visible damage. A burned library leaves visible absence. But a drawer of floppy disks that have passed the point of readability looks identical to a drawer of disks that are fully intact. The damage is below the surface, invisible to any inspection that does not involve actually attempting to read the disk, an attempt that may itself cause additional damage. The moment that archivists find most uncomfortable to describe is the moment they identify a disk that should contain something important, attempt to read it, and find that the coating is shed too far. The file names are sometimes still readable from the directory. The operating system's index of what the disk was supposed to contain. The files themselves, though, are gone, not lost somewhere that careful searching might locate. Gone in the most complete sense of the word. The disk is slid carefully into the imaging device. The head descends. The machine begins to listen. The first step in any recovery session is a physical assessment of the disk. A floppy stores data in a magnetic coating on a thin plastic substrate. Over decades, that coating can delaminate, shed particles, or become brittle. The lubricant protecting the surface from the read head also degrades. Some disks, if simply inserted into a standard drive, will shed coating so rapidly that the data is destroyed within the first seconds of contact. The physical assessment determines whether it is safe to proceed at all. The primary specialist tool for disk recovery is a controller device that connects a floppy drive to a modern computer and reads the raw magnetic flux transitions on the disk surface, rather than interpreting data according to any assumed format. This approach captures everything, including data in formats that no existing software can currently decode. The raw magnetic image is preserved first, and all decoding work is done afterward on a copy, with no further risk to the original medium. The disk surface shimmers under magnification. Each magnetic variation holds a binary choice, still readable or lost. Reading at the magnetic flux level goes below the level at which file systems operate. A standard drive interprets the magnetic surface and returns data according to the format it expects. A flux level reader does not interpret at all. It records the raw waveform of the disk surface as it passes the read head. This produces a format-agnostic image that can be decoded against any number of format specifications, tried one at a time, until the data resolves. The imaging hardware is only half the problem. The physical drive mechanism must be compatible with the specific disk. An 8-inch disk requires an 8-inch drive. A 5.25-inch disk requires a 5.25-inch drive. These drives are no longer manufactured anywhere in the world. Recovery specialists maintain collections of vintage hardware in various states of repair. And when a drive fails during a session, finding a compatible replacement can take weeks or longer, or sometimes never. One critical constraint during any recovery session is write blocking. The imaging process must never alter the original disk in any way. never update its directory, never record the time of access, never leave any trace of having been read. Modern operating systems write to storage media automatically when a drive is connected. Specialists use hardware write blockers, small physical devices installed between the drive and the computer, specifically to prevent any unintended write operation. Under ultraviolet light, the damage map becomes visible. Lost areas of coating glow differently from areas that still hold data. Many disks cannot be recovered completely. The magnetic coating has degraded in specific areas. Patches where the data is simply gone. What the recovery team receives in these cases is a partial disk image with unreadable sectors scattered through the data. The work then becomes a form of digital reconstruction, using file system analysis to determine which files are intact and which are fragmented, and attempting to reconstruct missing pieces from adjacent data or from secondary copies that may have been made on other media. Once a clean image has been obtained, the next challenge is format identification. Disk formats are not always documented, some are proprietary. Created by companies that no longer exist, never published in any technical standard, understood today only by communities of enthusiasts who have reverse engineered them over years. The specialist must identify the file system, the sector layout, the encoding method, and the application format of each recovered file, and for each of these, there may be no written guide whatsoever. The retrocomputing community, hobbyists who maintain and operate vintage computing hardware for personal interest, has become an essential partner in professional digital preservation. Enthusiasts have documented hundreds of obscure disk formats, built open source tools for reading them, and maintain collections of vintage hardware no longer held by any formal institution. Without this informal network of volunteers, many formats would already be permanently out of reach, with no remaining expertise anywhere capable of decoding them. The machine boots. Text fills the screen that no one has read in a very long time. When the data finally resolves, when the format is identified and the files are extracted, the moment is described as quietly affecting. A document opens that was written 30 or 40 years ago on a machine that no longer exists by someone who had no expectation that anyone would ever need to recover it. The content appears exactly as it was left. In some cases, the cursor is still positioned where the author was working on the very last day they saved the file. But recovery is only the first step. Reading data from a disk does not automatically make it usable. A document written in a proprietary word processor from 1988 may open as garbled text, or as a file that nothing modern can pass. The software that created it may have been abandoned or discontinued. Specialists must sometimes install operating system emulators and long-abandoned applications just to render the contents of a recovered file in a form that a researcher can actually read. In one documented case, recovered lecture files from a famous physicist were formatted in a specialized word processing system designed for scientific notation, a system whose developer had long since ceased to exist. Rendering the files required locating an original copy of the discontinued software, finding a machine capable of running it, and extracting the content page by page. Each lecture was complete and intact. The voice it contained had been sealed inside a dying format for more than 20 years, unread by any researcher. Recovered files are printed and compared against a second disc from the same collection. Every line agrees. Different institutions have developed different approaches to this work. Some focus on creating bit-level images of every disk in their collection before attempting to decode any. A triage strategy designed to preserve what can be preserved before further degradation occurs. Others work through collections systematically, from the most physically fragile media to the most stable. A small number of specialists have developed deep expertise in a single format, offering that expertise to institutions around the world on a case-by-case basis. The imaging first strategy has particular appeal for collections of unknown condition, where the format distribution and physical damage are not yet known. By imaging everything first, creating a permanent archival snapshot before any media is handled further. The team ensures that any subsequent damage affects only copies, not originals. The original discs, once imaged, can be placed in controlled storage and not disturbed again. Hard drive archaeology is a newer and even more specialised discipline. When a hard drive fails mechanically, when the read arm crashes against the platter surface or the actuator motor seizes, the data on the platters may still exist, intact but unreachable. Specialists working in controlled environments can disassemble the drive, move the platters into a donor chassis with functioning mechanics, and attempt a partial read before the exposed platters are damaged by the environment or by handling. At the furthest extreme of recovery work lie techniques used when conventional mechanical reading is no longer possible. Magnetic force microscopy, a method developed originally for materials science, can scan a disk surface at nanoscale resolution, mapping the magnetic domains that hold the data without any physical contact between probe and surface. This approach is slow and expensive, but it can read disks too damaged for any mechanical drive and can sometimes recover data from platters that have been partially overwritten. Inside a clean room, the drive's cover is removed and the platters exposed to air for the very first time. The cost of specialist data recovery presents a serious ethical problem for the field. A single hard drive recovery, depending on the complexity of the failure, can cost as much as the annual acquisition budget of a small archive. This creates a hierarchy of what gets saved. Material from well-funded institutions, from famous individuals, from commercially valuable collections. The personal papers of an unknown researcher, the creative work of an artist without institutional backing, are far less likely to ever be recovered. There is a recursive dimension to this problem that specialists find quietly troubling. The tools used for disk recovery are themselves subject to the same forces that threaten the disks. Specialist imaging controllers are manufactured in small quantities and their availability is not guaranteed. The software used to decode obscure formats is maintained by volunteers who may at any time lose interest, change careers, or simply run out of time. The expertise lies in a small number of people who are, like everyone, eventually mortal. A corridor of archive shelving stretches into dim distance, every shelf filled with storage boxes. The end is not visible. The scale of the unrecovered archive is impossible to estimate precisely, because no comprehensive inventory has ever been undertaken. Institutions know what physical media they hold, but not always what formats those media use, what operating systems created them, or how much of the data is still readable. The figure specialists return to most often is not a percentage. It is simply, more than anyone has the capacity to recover at the current pace of institutional investment and awareness. The rate of loss is accelerating, not slowing. Magnetic media degrades on a curve, slowly at first, then suddenly. A disk that was readable last year may not be readable next year and may not be readable at all by the year after. Specialists trained in the hardware of the 1980s and 1990s are retiring. The market for vintage drives is shrinking. The window for recovering certain formats is now measurable in years, not decades. And for some formats, that window is already closed. The problem does not end with floppy disks. Every storage format is eventually succeeded by another, and every transition produces a new generation of orphan media. Writable compact disks from the early 2000s are now in transition. The die layers of many disks are degrading and drives are becoming scarce. The optical disks burned across the 2000s and 2010s face similar questions. Even solid-state flash storage has failure modes over long time horizons that are poorly understood and rarely planned for. The disk surface shows the bronze ring pattern of optical degradation, a format quietly passing its readable limit. A particular anxiety concerns material created entirely in digital form and never printed, never physically copied. A photograph taken on a phone in 2010 and stored only on a hard drive that has since failed is, in principle, gone. A film shot digitally and stored on a proprietary system that was discontinued is, if the files were never migrated, unrecoverable. The same applies to emails, institutional databases, early social media archives, and entire categories of governmental record that exist now only in formats that are already being deprecated. Professional recovery involves not just technical expertise, but a form of historical reconstruction, an ability to determine, from partial evidence, the technical environment in which the data was created, what operating system version was running, what was the default sector size for that format at that time, what known bugs affected the file system on that revision of the software. Each question must be answered correctly in the right order before the data has any chance of resolving into readable files. No shortcut through this process exists. Against this backdrop, the open source and community-based approach to digital preservation represents something quietly remarkable. Tools for reading obscure disk formats, software emulators for obsolete operating systems, databases of format documentation, networks of enthusiasts willing to donate time and hardware. All of this exists outside any institutional budget, maintained by people who feel a genuine responsibility to a heritage they see slipping away. Their work does not make headlines, but for many formats, it is the only reason the data can still be read at all. The material that has been recovered has, where it has reached researchers, already produced historical discoveries that would not otherwise have been possible. Letters that historians did not know existed have clarified timelines and contradicted received accounts. Working drafts have shown how major ideas develop through stages that the finished published work entirely conceals. Scientific notes have revealed abandoned lines of research that might, with new knowledge, be worth revisiting. The past that seems settled turns out in these moments to still be arriving. A monitor fills with streaming text as a vintage drive connects successfully. Each line of output is another file recovered. Archivists who have thought carefully about the long term tend to arrive at the same conclusion, that the recovery window for the most at-risk formats is likely shorter than the time available to address it at the current pace of investment. What would be required is a coordinated, well-resourced international effort, something that has been proposed and discussed many times and never yet fully built. The material exists, the tools exist, the people exist. What has not yet existed is the collective will to treat it as urgent. The contrast with physical media is stark. A letter written on acid-free paper and stored in cool, dry conditions can remain readable for centuries without any special hardware, without any software, without anyone needing to understand the format. A floppy disk stored in the same conditions, holding 1,000 times more information, requires a functioning drive, a compatible operating system, and application software that may not have existed in any maintained form for decades. The digital revolution promised permanence. What it delivered, in many cases, was extreme fragility. There is a philosophical dimension to this that archivists sometimes articulate and sometimes simply feel. The people whose lives and work are stored on these disks recorded their thoughts in a medium that felt modern, reliable and lasting. They could not have anticipated that the format would become unreadable before their deaths, or that their digital files would prove less durable than a handwritten notebook in a drawer. The gap between what was intended and what has occurred is quietly immense. Institutions that have thought carefully about this are increasingly moving toward migration strategies that treat every digital format as temporary. Data is stored in multiple formats simultaneously, current formats for accessibility, open standard formats for long-term viability. It is migrated proactively on a schedule before formats become unsupported rather than after. Hardware and software dependencies are documented in detail and treated as part of the archive itself, rather than as external infrastructure that someone else is responsible for knowing about and maintaining. The drawer is pulled open again. Inside, a disk that has never been imaged, there is still time to try. The specialists who do this work describe themselves as neither nostalgic nor pessimistic. They are pragmatic about what can still be saved and honest about what cannot. They know that some of the material in the collections they work through will not be recovered, that the coating will have shed too far, or the format will prove undocumented, or the hardware will fail before the session is complete. They do the work anyway. because the alternative is to stop, and they find they cannot do that. Every generation creates more digital material than the one before it. Every generation also inherits the format problems of its predecessor. The discs now being painstakingly recovered in libraries and workshops across the world were once the leading edge of how knowledge was stored. They were the future. What will future archivists think of the storage formats of this present moment? The cloud services, the proprietary platforms, the subscription software, and what will be required to recover what has been placed inside them? The drawer is gently closed. What is inside is still there. Whether it can still be read is another question. It is the night of November 2nd, 1988. Somewhere on the network, something small begins to move. The internet of 1988 bears no resemblance to what we know today. There are no web pages, no images, no video. Only a sparse network of terminals, green text on dark screens connected by telephone lines, and academic goodwill. The machines sit at universities and government research facilities, communicating through an early research network. In late 1988, this network connects roughly 60,000 computers. It is a small, trusting community. Nobody has any reason yet to be afraid. The machines are not all in the same place. They sit scattered across hundreds of campuses and laboratories, connected by a web of leased lines and dedicated circuits. Each node in the network trusts the others by default. There are no firewalls. There is no authentication beyond a username and a password. The administrators who manage these systems think of themselves as part of a cooperative. Colleagues sharing a resource, not defenders guarding a perimeter. On the evening of November 2nd, the machines begin to behave strangely. Processors that should be nearly idle are running at full capacity. Simple commands take seconds to respond rather than milliseconds. Login prompts hang. Systems that should reply instantly sit frozen, as if caught in a loop they cannot exit. The administrators who notice first assume it is a hardware fault, a failed component, a misconfigured service. They reach for their logs, looking for the thing they must have missed. The phone starts ringing across the country, a campus in the east. The same symptoms, then another, then a third. The administrators compare notes. They are careful, methodical people, trained to check obvious explanations before assuming something extraordinary. But the symptoms refuse to fit anything familiar. The machines are not failing, they are consumed, occupied by some process that nobody asked them to run, using every available resource to do something invisible. It is not a hardware fault. It is not a misconfiguration. It is something that does not yet have a name. The machine logs reveal the shape of it. Hundreds of login attempts arriving from remote addresses, not at human speed, but machine speed, dozens per second. Something is trying to access every reachable machine on the network, and something is already inside many of them. The timestamps are seconds apart. The entries repeat, line after line, in a rhythm that no person could produce. Whatever is out there is not a person. By 9 in the evening on the East Coast, machines at research universities are going down. Some administrators disconnect from the network immediately to stop the spread. Others stay online, hoping to understand what they are dealing with before acting. There is no protocol for any of this. There is no organisation to call, no authority with experience in what is happening. In 1988, the concept of a coordinated cybersecurity response does not yet exist. Email is still working, barely. Administrators send warnings to each other across the same network the worm is consuming, sharing symptoms, partial theories and questions nobody can answer. Some messages never arrive. The network is too congested. Others arrive hours late. But the warning spread, slowly campus to campus, and a community that has never faced anything like this begins, haltingly, imperfectly, to form a response. By midnight, thousands of machines have gone dark. An entire research network spanning a continent has fallen silent. Morning arrives. Researchers, officials, and military personnel reach their terminals to find them unresponsive. Computer centres from the east coast to the west are entirely offline. When the damage is eventually tallied, the count falls somewhere between 6,000 and 9,000 machines, roughly 1 in every 10 computers connected to the early internet. In a single overnight window, without warning and without any visible sign of an attacker, 10% of the connected world had gone quiet. Nobody fully understands yet what happened. The investigation is just beginning, but something is already clear to everyone who sat through that night. The network had been used as a vector for the first time. Something had travelled it like a living thing, finding machines, entering them, making copies of itself, and moving on. The world would soon have a name for what had just visited it. They would call it a worm. To understand what happened, you have to go back several months. At a computer science graduate program in the northeastern United States, a student is working on a research question that in 1988 seems almost philosophical. He is not motivated by malice, not chasing notoriety or money. He is curious about something simple, quiet, and as it turns out, dangerous. How large is the internet? How many machines are actually connected? Nobody knows for certain. The question seems straightforward. But the early internet has no central directory, no map, no registry of connected machines. You cannot simply look it up. The only way to count the machines on the network is to visit them. And the only practical way to visit them all is to write a program that can travel on its own, moving from machine to machine, incrementing a counter as it goes. The concept of a self-replicating program is not new. Researchers have written about it theoretically since the 1970s. Programs that can make copies of themselves and move through systems have appeared in academic papers, in thought experiments, in science fiction. But nobody has ever released one into the wild. The early internet community trusts itself. The idea that someone might use the network to spread an autonomous, self-replicating program seems, at this moment, almost quaint. He sits down to write a small program. An elegant question posed in code addressed to the entire network. The program is designed with care. It will travel from machine to machine using the network's own infrastructure. When it arrives on a new machine, it will check to see whether it is already there. If it finds itself already installed, it will stop. It will not replicate again. The design is meant to be self-limiting, a program that can spread, but that will naturally prevent itself from accumulating too many copies in any one place. But he anticipates a problem. What if a machine is configured to lie, to claim it already has the program installed when it does not? The worm would stop replicating, and the count of the network's total size would be inaccurate. This is a reasonable concern for a researcher who wants clean data. To guard against it, he adds a rule. Even if a machine claims to already have the program, the worm will replicate anyway, but only one time in 7. 1 in 7 sounds like a small number. In practice, it means the program can never fully stop itself. Every time it encounters a machine claiming to already be infected, there is a 1 in 7 chance that it installs anyway and begins the process again. On a connected network where machines talk to each other constantly, this is not a small number. This is exponential growth. This is the flaw that will make the program a catastrophe. To travel from machine to machine, the program needs a way in. The student identifies 3 separate vulnerabilities in software that runs on almost every machine in the network. All of them documented, none of them yet patched. A bug in an email daemon that allows remote code execution. A flaw in a remote access service that trusts the wrong credentials. A weakness in how passwords are stored and verified. The program exploits all 3 simultaneously. The program also carries a list, 432 common passwords, tried in sequence until one opens the door. Many of them work. The early internet community is not in the habit of choosing strong passwords. Usernames that match passwords. Passwords left at their factory defaults. Accounts set up in a hurry years ago never changed. The program moves through them systematically, trying each one, and on machine after machine, somewhere in the list, a door opens. Security, in 1988, is still mostly a matter of hoping nobody is looking. The program is also, by the standards of 1988, technically sophisticated. It is written in two parts: a small bootstrap section that does nothing but fetch the rest of the program from the infected machine that launched it, and a main body that handles travel, replication, and the various exploits. The main body is compressed and encoded. It is difficult to read, even for the experts who will eventually get their hands on it. In the late afternoon of November 2nd, the program is complete. He reviews it one final time, checking the code, tracing the logic, looking for errors. He finds none that he recognises. What he's built is smaller than he expected, and in some ways more elegant. He's aware that what he's about to do is not entirely sanctioned. He is also, somehow, not entirely aware of what it is about to become. He logs into a terminal at a distant university. At 6:02 in the evening, the program is released. Within minutes, first copies have already reached new machines. Within an hour, the worm has travelled to dozens of nodes across the network. The 1 in 7 rule is already compounding. Every infected machine is trying to infect new ones. Machines that report being already infected still have a 1 in 7 chance of infection anyway. The program is not growing at the rate its creator imagined. It is growing much, much faster. The student, watching from a distance, realises something is wrong. The program is not self-limiting. It is accelerating. He sends a message to a friend, asking him to distribute a warning and a partial fix through the same network the worm is consuming. The message arrives too late for most systems. The network is already too congested to deliver it reliably. His attempt to warn the people he has endangered is swallowed by the flood he has created. By 8 p.m, the network is overwhelmed, machines are slowing everywhere. The worm is in thousands of systems now. Across the country, the alarms go off. Not electronic ones. Human ones. Pages, phone calls, voices repeating the same question. At universities and research facilities, teams assemble in the middle of the night. Nobody has been trained for this. There is no playbook, no established procedure. The people gathering around terminal screens are researchers and professors and graduate students. People whose job is to advance knowledge, not to fight for their machines, but here they are, at midnight, trying to understand what has colonized their systems. The machines are running something. That much is clear. The processor loads are maxed, the disks are spinning. Something is consuming every available resource. But finding it, isolating it, is another matter entirely. The worm is not hiding, exactly. But it is moving so quickly, spawning so many copies of itself, that by the time any individual copy is identified and killed, dozens more have taken its place. The network itself is still technically up, but the traffic flooding it makes it nearly useless. Every infected machine is trying to contact every other machine it can reach, attempting to spread the worm, probing for open doors. The sheer volume of this traffic is crowding out all other communication. The internet is not down in the way a power grid goes down. It is drowning in itself. At a computer science department in the Midwest, a researcher sits down with a copy of The Worm and starts reading. He has obtained a fragment of the worm's code, captured from the memory of an infected machine. It is not the whole program, not yet, but it is enough to begin understanding the mechanism. He reads through the night, tracing the logic, identifying the exploits, mapping the structure. He is doing, in a compressed and desperate form, the work that would later be called malware analysis. The field does not yet have that name. He is inventing it as he goes. By early morning, he has a partial picture. He understands the 3 vulnerabilities the worm exploits. He understands the password list. He can see in the code the 1 in 7 rule. And he understands immediately why it is catastrophic. He begins writing a counter-program, not a cure exactly, but a disinfectant. A program that can be run on an infected machine to stop the worm from spreading further. The fix in principle is straightforward. Patch the 3 vulnerabilities. Remove the worm from infected machines. Enforce stronger passwords. In practice, distributing any of this is extraordinarily difficult. The network they would normally use to send information, email, file transfers, is the same network the worm is consuming. Every message they try to send competes with the worm's traffic for the same congested pipes. Emergency calls go out to vendors, to universities, to anyone with the authority to take a network node offline. Some administrators make the decision to disconnect entirely, pulling their institution off the network to stop the spread. It is not a small decision. These machines are the research infrastructure of the most connected community in the world. Going offline means losing access to collaborators, to databases, to computing resources that researchers depend on. But staying online means the worm will keep spreading. Many choose to disconnect. The information sharing problem is solved partly by going backward in time. Researchers who need to coordinate pick up telephones, they send information by fax. Some send hard copies through campus mail. The most advanced communications network in the world is responding to its first major crisis by falling back on analog tools from decades earlier. The irony is not lost on anyone in the rooms where this is happening. A partial patch for the most critical vulnerability, the bug in the email daemon, is distributed within 12 hours of the worm's release. Getting it installed on vulnerable machines is slower. Each administrator has to apply it manually to each individual machine. There are thousands of them run by different institutions, operating under different policies, accessible only with the right credentials. This is a manual operation in a crisis that demands speed. Within 48 hours, the worm is contained. The network recovers, slowly, as infected machines are cleaned and reconnected. The final damage estimate, when it is eventually calculated, runs to hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost machine time, restoration labour and disrupted research. In 1988 terms, this is a significant sum. In terms of the future, it is almost nothing. The real cost will not be measured in dollars. For the people who spent those 48 hours at their terminals, the experience leaves a permanent mark. They have seen for the first time what a connected network looks like when it is being used against itself. They have seen it fail to coordinate, fail to communicate, fail to respond with any of the speed the threat required. They carry that memory for the rest of their careers. The worm is gone. The machines are coming back online. The network is quiet again. But nothing is the same. The cleanup takes days. Machine after machine has to be rebuilt from scratch, not patched and restored, but completely wiped and reinstalled because nobody can be certain the worm has not left something behind. This is another first. The concept of a system being irreversibly compromised, of trust in a machine being so thoroughly broken that the only safe answer is to erase it and begin again. It is a lesson that will be repeated many times over the decades that follow. The worm is contained. The investigation begins. Federal agents ask the same question everyone else is asking. Who wrote this? The forensic analysis of the worm's code and the path of its launch is careful and methodical. Logs from affected machines trace the worm back through the network, hop by hop, toward its source. A distant university used to launch the program is identified. Records from that machine point toward a login that does not belong there. A credential used briefly at a specific moment, then abandoned. The trail is thin, but it is a trail. The person at the end of that trail is a graduate student named Robert Morris. What makes his identity striking when it becomes known is the context. His father is a senior cryptographer at the National Security Agency, one of the people whose work helped shape the security architecture of the early internet. The son of a man who helped build the network's defences had nearly destroyed the network. The irony is noted, quietly, by everyone involved. It is not the irony of malice. By most accounts, Robert Morris is not a malicious person. The worm was, by his own account, an experiment, a research tool that malfunctioned. The 1 in 7 rule was a safeguard that became a failure mode. The vulnerabilities he exploited were not secrets. He simply assembled known tools into a combination nobody had thought through to its end. He contacts a lawyer and shortly afterward surrenders to authorities. His statement is consistent. The The worm was never intended to damage anything. He expected it to travel quietly, count machines, and stop. The damage was an accident, a result of the flaw in the 1 in 7 rule, which he had not thought through completely. Whether that explanation is accepted will be a matter for a court to decide. In January of 1990, the trial begins. It is a federal case under a law barely 2 years old. The law he is charged under is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, passed in 1986, originally aimed at hackers who broke into government computers. It had never been used to prosecute anyone before. Robert Morris becomes, by the outcome of this trial, the first person in history to be convicted under that law. The verdict arrives in January 1990. Guilty. The sentencing comes several months later. The sentence is lighter than many expected. 3 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, a fine of just over $10,000, no prison time. The judge calibrated the punishment for what the case actually was, not a calculated attack, but an experiment conducted without adequate thought for the consequences. The sentence reflects the ambiguity that would hang over computer crime law for decades to come. Robert Morris goes on to complete his doctorate. He becomes a professor. He co-founds a startup, later becomes a partner in one of the most influential technology investment programs of its era. His career continues, successful and distinguished, alongside the permanent historical footnote of the night he nearly broke the internet. He is, by most accounts, a person who learned from what he did and who spent the rest of his career contributing to the field it had damaged. For the internet itself, however, the worm is not a footnote. The weeks immediately after the incident produced something that the network has never had before, a formal, funded, government-backed organisation whose sole purpose is to coordinate the response to future incidents like this one. It is the first cybersecurity institution of the modern era, and its existence begins because of that one night in November. The world's first computer emergency response team stands up within weeks. The internet now has an immune system. The team is staffed initially by researchers who were awake the night the worm spread, people who had fought it with whatever they had: telephone lines, fax machines, half-written patches distributed by hand. They are given an institutional home at a major research university in Pennsylvania. They are given a mandate to monitor the network for threats, coordinate responses, and make sure that next time the response is faster and better organised. The model is replicated. Within years, similar teams appear at universities and government agencies across the country. Within a decade, they exist in dozens of countries. Within 2 decades, nearly every major government and hundreds of private organisations maintain their own version of what was built in the weeks after November 1988. The infrastructure of modern cybersecurity, traced back to its source, leads to this moment. The worm also changes something less tangible. Before November 2nd, 1988, most of the people on the early internet assumed that the network was fundamentally safe. This assumption was never written down anywhere. It did not need to be. It was simply the shared understanding of a community of colleagues who trusted each other, because they had always trusted each other, and nothing had given them a reason not to. After November 2nd, 1988, that assumption is gone. It does not return. Every conversation about network architecture, every design decision, every new protocol proposed from that point forward carries, somewhere inside it, the awareness that the network is not inherently safe, that it can be used against itself, that the question of security is not an afterthought, it is the beginning of the conversation, every time. The code still exists, preserved in archives, loaded with care into isolated systems where it cannot touch the world. The worm source is not large by any modern measure, its bootstrap section. The part that runs first fetches the rest of the program and initiates the infection process, is fewer than 100 lines. The main body runs to a few thousand more. In the hierarchy of malicious software that comes after it, the Morris worm is modest, but size is not what made it significant. Researchers who study the code describe it as elegant. The 3 exploits are not brute force, they are precise, each targeting the specific behaviour in a specific piece of widely used software. The password list is carefully chosen. The bootstrap mechanism is clean and efficient. It is the work of someone who understood the systems he was targeting deeply, which makes it more dangerous, not less, that he misjudged what it would do. In university courses on computer security, the worm's code is read the way medical students read historical case studies of diseases. Not to replicate it, the vulnerabilities it exploited are long obsolete, but to understand how infections propagate, how they resist containment, how a small flaw in a self-limiting mechanism becomes a catastrophic runaway process. The worm teaches something that formal security theory alone cannot. Security researchers still load the worm into air-gapped machines, computers deliberately disconnected from any network, to observe it working. It still behaves exactly as it did in 1988. It still tries to spread. It still probes for the vulnerabilities it was built to exploit, still tries the passwords on its list. Those specific vulnerabilities no longer exist on modern systems, but the behavior, the logic, the mechanism, all of it is unchanged. What the worm revealed was not a flaw in software. It was a flaw in how the internet understood itself. Before the worm, the implicit model of the early internet was that of a library. An open, trusting space where people came to share and to learn, governed by professional norms rather than technical enforcement. You did not need a lock on the door because everybody who came through the door was assumed to be a colleague. That model was not wrong for the community that existed at the time, but it was fragile. The assumption of trust, never written, never formalised, never tested, shattered on the night of November 2nd, 1988, and the thing that replaced it, the assumption of adversariality of risk, of the need to defend every system against every possible intrusion, has defined network design ever since. Every firewall, every encrypted connection, every intrusion detection system is, in part, a response to what happened that night. Almost every major security practice in use in the modern internet traces its conceptual lineage to the weeks after the Morris worm. Patch management, the formal process of identifying and distributing fixes for known vulnerabilities, intrusion detection, monitoring systems for signs of unauthorized access, incident response, the formalized practice of coordinating a counteraction, network segmentation, dividing networks into zones with controlled access between them, all of it grown from a single night. The internet's immune system was built in a panic in 1988. It has been reinforced every single day since then. The worm itself lasted less than 72 hours in the wild before it was contained. Its consequences have lasted nearly 40 years. The machines it crashed were decommissioned long ago. The operating systems it exploited are entirely obsolete. The passwords on its list have been changed 100 times over. But the world it made, cautious, defensive, aware of its own vulnerability, is the world we still live in. In the archives of institutions that preserve the history of computing, a copy of the worm's original source rests in a carefully maintained file, time-stamped to the evening of November 2nd, 1988. It is treated with the care that is given to primary sources, a document that cannot be replaced, that tells something important about a moment before which things were one way and after which they were another. Historians call it the first artifact of the digital security age, the thing that made the modern internet necessary. A single vintage computer sits behind preservation glass in a research archive, its screen dark and its power disconnected. The machine is perhaps 30 years old. Its plastic housing has yellowed. It is the kind of object that draws no attention in a room full of more interesting things. It sits in its case without ceremony, without explanation. It looks harmless. Everything about it looks harmless. And yet the software that changed the internet was written on a machine exactly like this one. The question the graduate student was trying to answer: how large is the internet? Has an answer now, though it changes every second. The internet spans billions of devices, crosses every border, touches nearly every human life. It is defended, constantly, by systems and organisations and practices that trace their origin to a single night in November, 37 years ago, and a small program escaped its author's intentions and changed everything it touched.